All right. Well, my name's Linda Driver, and I'm a master gardener in San Joaquin County in California. Sometimes we get people from all kinds of places. And this presentation is about orchids. We are going to talk about orchids. And the reason why one of the reasons I agreed to do this is I have an orchid problem. I like orchids. They're pretty. I buy them. They're pretty for a long time, which is a good reason to buy them. I mean, when you go in the store and you see something that looks like this and it only costs $14, you say, that's a deal. And so you bring it home and it looks really good for a long time. And eventually it loses its flowers. And trust me, nobody buys an orchid for its leaves. I mean, they can be okay, but they're certainly not something you're going to spend a big amount of money for. And then the other part of my orchid problem is I cannot throw away anything that shows signs of life. So I end up with lots of orchids. And part of today's activity is getting rid of lots of orchids. So anyway, we have a PowerPoint presentation that has lots of information in it that Kelly put together. And I have to go get myself, I have to share screen, and I have to pick that presentation, and away we go. So there's a lot of orchids in the world, and we're not going to talk about all of the orchids because then we would be here for the rest of our lives. And if you want to know more, there's the American Orchid Society that has information on a whole lot of different kinds of orchids. What we're going to talk about today are the kind that you find in the grocery store waiting for you. So there's a lot of cultivars. I mean, the selection is unending. And if you're like me, you say, oh, I haven't had that one before. And so you buy it. It's an interesting flower in that the sepals sort of look like petals, but they aren't. And they cover up the flower before it blooms, but they open up and they're colored, and so they are part of what you perceive as the flower. And then a thing that's characteristic of orchids is that lip that sits out. It's a landing pad for pollinators, which I think is a pretty neat modification. The leaves, broad and flat with parallel veins. It's a monocot. And I tell people, it took me a long time to figure out why one needed to know a word like monocot, because there's monocotyledons and dicotyledons. And the only difference is a monocot has one leaf that comes out of the seed and a dicot has two. And the reason you have it is because it tells you which page to go to when you're doing a plant ID thing. It's the first separator. And so all of the monocots have parallel veins in their leaves and sort of long strappy kind of leaves usually. Healthy roots are green, and isn't this a wonderful word, turgid? Sort of means fat, kind of. And covered with, and I always pronounce this wrong, but I think it's velamen. Anyway, and it's kind of a shiny stuff that's on the outside of the roots. They like to grow on a support, just as a tree. And most of the orchids that you buy, they come, when you see them in the store, they've got a stake in them, and that's holding the flowers spike up in the air. On their own, they would kind of droop over. And so when you're going to grow your own, when you're going to try to make it rebloom, you need to watch out for the spike that's arising with the flowers on it and make sure it gets staked right away so that it's not hanging down on the table or the floor or whatever. Okay, they don't need soil. They get nutrients from dust. And if you live in Stockton, there's plenty of that. Animal droppings, decomposing bark, and the decomposing bark might be part of the potting mix. And they absorb moisture from the air. So they like a moist environment, but they don't like to be soggy. Okay, and then these are some of the other kinds of orchids that you can get. And we have, if you want to know more about these, there's lots and lots of information about them. And I'm not going to go into them in depth right now. Just know, okay, if it isn't one of those, it must be something else. And we have resources for you to be able to figure out what kind you have. Most of the time when you buy one, it comes with a tag that tells you what it is and tells you something about how to care for it. So, okay, unnamed plant, Noid is fine if you don't, and it's not necessarily thing. Depends on how fancy you want to be. So far I've been happy with what I find at Trader Joe's or Costco or Safeway, places I go. And you want to look for one that is in good shape, and you want to look for one that the leaves should be clean. Did somebody ask? I thought I heard somebody. Anyway, the leaves should be clean, should be medium green, and free from pests and blemishes. And that's the ones that you can see, but sometimes you don't see it until later. And sometimes right after you get one home, like this one that I've just bought. It has one leaf on it that needs to be trimmed off, and a couple of the buds are not gonna open, but most of the rest of them look pretty good at this point in time. And so it's doing okay. Not great, but okay. All right. And you should do, whenever you're buying a plant, you want to be looking for these kind of things. You want to look for a healthy looking plant. You should see roots. And if you have flowers, they should, I can't imagine buying one that didn't have flowers. Anyway, if it has flowers on it, you want it to be well supported, and you want some of them to be unopened, but it's sort of a balance. You want some that are already open and some that aren't. And look for ones that look like no matter what, they'll complete opening, because sometimes they don't. They dry up and fall off. And you would like to not have that happen to you. And if you're buying in a place that sells a lot of them, there's going to be a lot of movement through there, so that you should always have pretty decent plants, because they come from a grower, get to the store, and the motive of the store is to get them to go out the door. So anyway, this is your classic Phalaenopsis, the moth orchid. And you can see all of those buds look like they will finish opening up, and they look healthy, and I don't see any bugs crawling around on it. And so that's one that you say, okay, it looks like you get to go home. Okay, temperature, space, light, air movement, water, and nutrients. All of these things make a difference on how well your orchid does. The Phalaenopsis are fairly tolerant of temperatures that most people have in their homes. Let's see, what does it say? 75 to 80 degrees during the day, and 75 to 85 in the day, and 60 degrees at night. That sounds like about temperatures that most people are happy living in. So where you're happy living, they're happy living. They want space, and that is something that, if you have a orchid habit, can get dicey after a while, because you start crowding them together, and that's not a good thing to do. Light, they want bright light, but not direct sunlight. And so my best place in my house is my south-facing windows, because there's a deciduous tree that shades the front yard. So in the summertime, when the sun would be too much, there's shade. And in the wintertime, when there's not as much sun, the shade is gone because the leaves fell off. So that's my best spot for my orchids. And I have a west-facing window that is similar, but often it's hard to get them to get enough light. Air movement, you don't want them to be in a draft, but you want the air to be able to move around, and you need to water them. And watering for these orchids, they should get watered and then get watered again just when they're almost completely dry, but not completely dry. So that means usually somewhere between 7 to 10 days. 7 to 10 days is about right. And if you can kind of keep with that schedule, it'll be good. And then most orchids like to be fertilized, and they like to be fertilized weekly. Weekly is the phrase I've always heard, which means that every week you give them a light. Every time you water them, you give them a little little bit of fertilizer, not a huge dose. Okay, so we've got the higher temps will require more humidity. One of the things that works really good, and I think we have a slide picture that shows like an aluminum pan with some gravel in it to create moisture, humidity. And another thing that I found works really good is like if you have a wider thing, they have in department stores, they have things called boot trays, which are meant to be put by your front door, and your muddy boots go on the tray. And they are only about an inch deep or so. And they work really good to protect your furniture. You can put one of those down and put gravel in it, and then you can set several orchids on top of it, and it'll do a good job of keeping it humid. Not too cold at night. My house is probably sometimes too cold at night. It is, thank goodness, rarely ever in the 90 degrees for the too hot. And I can't read what the top of the slide says, but anyway, roots should be snug. Air roots exposed are okay. So those ones that stick out of the pot and kind of hang over and grow everywhere, it's okay. They're just fine. You just don't want you don't want these things rubbing shoulders with each other. So keep it so that there's room for air movement to move around, and for them they like to have their own space. They want social distancing. Okay, different orchids need different things. And so that plant tag that comes with the orchid when you buy it, pay attention to what it says, because some of them don't need as much light. Some of them like more light. Depends on which one you have. The cymbidiums that I have, they live out in the yard. I never bring them in. They stay out there all year, even in the wintertime. Okay, this is probably my greatest sin when it comes to treating my orchids badly, is a lot of my orchids have dark green leaves, and dark green leaves mean you're not giving them enough light. So a lighter green is what you're looking for, but you also don't want them to get sunburned. So if you got to be somewhere in that neighborhood, but no sunburn, but no dark and dank room. And as you can see there, that's the color of green that you're shooting for. You want it to be that light grassy kind of green. And that's what happens when you get too much sunlight. And especially if water ends up on the leaves and is getting too much sunlight, that's a really good way to get sunburn. Okay, windowsills, the fan. A fan is not a draft. A draft would be something coming straight out of your AC or your heat vent. But a fan just moves the air around in the whole room, so it makes it more pleasant for you, and it makes it more pleasant for the orchids. So, and fans actually don't use very much energy, so they're a great way to keep your house more livable for both you and your orchids. Overwatering. That is probably another one of my sins when it comes to orchids, is watering them too much. They don't want to be soggy. And the Phalaenopsis especially do not want you to get them wet at their crown, right where the leaves come out. They don't want that. And that's a good way to kill them. It seemed like at one time I've been guilty of using an ice cube, which is not a good thing to do because they don't like it cold. And if in doubt, wait another day. It's better to let it be a little dry than let it be too wet. Almost dry before rewatering. And it says they'll appear silvery and somewhat shriveled if dry. And those of you who are going to get an orchid kit, you'll get to see examples of both of those things. The pot's light when it's dry. Yeah, okay, makes sense. And humidity around 50%, which we never, I think, well, maybe during rain, which I understand that rain does happen. and I'm really hoping that it returns to Central California at some point in time. But most of the time, our humidity level is not that much. That's why putting it on some gravel and adding some water to it is a great idea for taking care of your orchids. And that's an example of healthy roots. Do they look dry? And the answer is, I think some of them do and some of them don't. Some of the ones that are in the pot kind of look a little on the dry, dead side, but the ones that are hanging over the outside don't look dry to me. And there's a bamboo skewer is what I think that person's using there to stick down in the pot and to see whether or not it's dry down inside the pot. Depends on what kind of potting medium you have too. Okay. Copiously. Isn't that a wonderful word? A whole lot. Don't wet the leaves or the crown. Sometimes I stick them in a bucket and let the water really get inside. Depends on what kind of potting media it is. And sometimes I probably let mine sit too long. And it says avoid distilled or softened water. So water straight from your tap is fine. And then drain it before you put it back in its catch pot. Because if you don't, then it's like sitting in water all the time. And there's a picture of those aluminum trays being used as a humidity tray. And those don't look like the really deep ones, but I'm sure you could use the really deep ones. And most orchid pots like to have holes in the side of some sort, unless they're sitting inside a catch pot. And that's a handy dandy temperature, and trying to read it. I think it says, yeah, it's got the humidity there. So you can see both the temperature and the humidity on that instrument. They've probably gotten a lot cheaper and are easy to find these days. Okay, feed only after bloom has ended. So if it's got a flower on it, don't feed it. That's pretty simple. Use a quality orchid food. Mix weekly with water, 3 weeks out of 4. So that's another way to do it. And the leaching avoids the buildup of salts. So that would be where you'd really want to get it good and wet and let it drain through. Okay, depends on what kind of potting media you use. So the bark might need more nitrogen, but you'll have to read up on what it is you choose to use and what you need to do, because there are 28,000 different species. So they need a lot of different things. Okay. There's a picture there of what it looks like when the flowers have gone bye-bye and time to repot. And let's see, where'd it go? Okay. The orchid kits that I put together had teaching orchids in them. That's my name for an orchid that needs to be repotted. So like this one here, that is good, that I want to give to somebody. It's a fairly healthy looking plant, but you can see the flowers are done, so they need to be cut off. And then it needs to be pulled out of the pot. And we're going to go over that in detail later. But and if it's been a long time since it's been repotted, you need to repot it. Okay, this one shows you where to cut that so that you get another spike. So, and you'll have this slideshow that you can refer back to at a later time. Robin, has anybody had any questions or anything so far?
Sorry, Linda, I was on mute. We've answered them in the chat room. It's been tap water and other things that have been covered. So we're good so far. Thank you.
Okay, great. Thank you. Okay, so when to repot? When the stuff in If it started off as bark and it looks like dust, it's time to repot. If it just looks like it, if it's been a couple of years, it needs to be repot. And if the roots are climbing outside the pot, it probably wants to be repotted. So, and if you don't know and it's new to you, then it doesn't hurt to repot it. Okay, when we planned this was supposed to be an in-person presentation, and I had a hands-on activity planned so that everybody who came to the workshop would get an orchid to repot. And then COVID interfered, and so we are doing Zoom. And so that's why I made orchid kits. And I was going to do a do along with me thing, but when I did my practice one the other day, it took me about an hour. So I figured it was probably better to talk about it and give the kits out and let people take their hour doing it. So when it says work slowly and do not rush, take your time, because it took a long time to get the old potting medium off of the orchid that I was repotting. So find out if there's any technique that you need to use. And if you do it incorrectly, it might just sit there and pout for a very long time. So, and then only repot when the roots and the medium are well hydrated. And I'll talk about that more when we get to the repotting part. There's going to be some of this is going to be repeated. So carefully remove the dead roots in each piece of potting media, and try not to damage any of your healthy ones. Every once in a while, I had one that had grown through a hole in the pot. It got sacrificed. Use sterilized tools. This is something that you should probably make a habit of, even whether it's pruning roses or anything else. It's good to clean your tools and to sterilize them between plants, because if one plant is sick and you cut that plant and then you go to another plant, you can transfer a virus, you can transfer other illnesses for the plant while you're doing that. So one of the ways to do it is alcohol wipes or a bleach solution. But you want to do it, but if you're working on one plant, you're okay. But if you're moving from plant to plant, clean your tools afterwards and before. Do it gently. Doesn't like to be handled roughly on its roots. And then after you've finished repotting, water it and let it drain, and then begin fertilizing.
Linda?
Yeah.
Okay, we have a couple of questions about potting.
Okay.
One of them is, how do you know when to size up for a pot, or what size pot to use? And then the second question is, what kind of pots to use?
Okay. Well, those are very good questions. I should have gone out and gotten, okay, this one here, I'm going to show, this is the common thing that you find when you go to when you buy an orchid at the grocery store or nursery. You find it's got a plastic liner pot, and I don't know if you can see or not, but it has holes in it along the sides so that it drains really well. And another kind of orchid pot to use, which I have a bunch of them outside and I should have brought one in, are ceramic kind of pots that are built so that they have holes in them. And so they will drain and let air circulate and stuff, and promote you not having something sitting in a bog of water. These plastic pots, they're not terribly attractive on their own. And so they always come with a ceramic catch pot. That's what this is called, is a catch pot. And if you see, the plastic pot fits right inside. But this, when you do this, you have to be very careful that when you're watering, you make sure that you don't let it sit in water. You need to take it out and water it and let it drain before you put it back in the catch pot. Now, as to knowing when to upsize it. I think that for the most of the kits that I put together and for most orchids, if you, after you remove all the old media, if you take it away, you'll see how much actual orchid you have. And I mean, and after you've cut away any dead roots and, you know, any dead leaves, anything that needs to be gone, now you get to see what it is you're actually dealing with. And very often they fit back into the same pot they came out of, but just with new bark or um, sphagnum moss, whatever the potting medium is. And if you look at it and it doesn't look like it would fit, because it likes its roots to be cozy. I mean, it doesn't want a lot of room around it. They like to be crowded. So I think if you saw one that had really actually grown a whole lot and it obviously wasn't going to fit back into the pot you took it out of, that's the time to go up. But for the most part, in my experience, they've stayed pretty much in the size pot they came in, at least for 1 or 2 times anyway. The potting mix that you use, it really helps if it sort of matches the size of the plant you're doing. And so if you've got a little bitty orchid, well, then little bitty pieces of bark or sphagnum moss work really good. If you have a bigger one, then there's room for the bigger pieces of bark to fit in around the roots and everything.
I'll leave this up to you. If you wanted to pick these, well, those are October 15th is the last day we can pick up bones, and Whitstable Pearl.
Excuse me, somebody needs to mute themselves, please. I'm not sure who's talking. Thank you. Okay. Other things that go into mix, potting mix are charcoal, fiber, volcanic rock sometimes used, all things that kind of are light and kind of help water move through, but and drain well and don't compact. That's one of the reasons, one of the things that tells you when it needs to be repotted. If the material has broken down and it looks more like soil than it does bark, that's probably time. Sphagnum moss works well, and it's easy to move around. I used it on some baby orchids, and often the ones that you get from the grocery store come and in sphagnum moss, and it works really well. But you need to pay attention to the watering and the repotting. And I think the reason why it comes with the grocery store ones is probably easier and faster to do, which makes more money for the growers in the grocery stores. I haven't tried this expanded clay material. I'm not sure what they do to expand it. That's one of the things that I need to learn more about. If Kelly or Robin, do you know about the expanded clay stuff?
I've never used it. I've used wine corks, but I've never used expanded clay.
Okay. Well, I haven't either, but it looks like something I could have made when I was taking ceramics. Anyway, if you're using that, apparently you don't want to use the regular potting media. So that's an experiment I have not yet tried. You want to stake things. As I said that before, you want to have a stake in to support your flower spike, because otherwise they will droop and then they'll get broken more often. And that's not something you want. And then there's something elegant about that big display of arch of flowers, which is part of the reason we buy them. And so I'm not sure how you would water that one that's hanging on the wall there, but maybe just mist it. But it looks really pretty. I'm just not sure how easy it would be to water. And then orchids, like many other things, can have lots and lots and lots of different kinds of problems. And the one that is my bane is mealybugs. And my next slide prediction show has pictures of mealybugs and some ways of combating them. So, all right, and pests, as you can see, those are some, looks like mealybugs attacking another kind of orchid. And you can go to the American Orchid Society and get a lot of information about all those different kinds of pests and what you can try to do. I keep thinking that there ought to be like a gas chamber that you could stick them in and that would kill all the bugs. Spider mites are a problem for some people. I think Kelly has great fondness for spider mites and thrips, which are small and hard to see, and they both cause not nice things to happen to your orchids or other plants. And there's a picture of the mealybugs. Those mealybugs are, I don't know if any of you are Star Trek fans, but if you remember the episode with the trouble with tribbles, and Dr. McCoy was explaining them to Captain Kirk, and he said, I think they're born pregnant. And I think that might apply to mealybugs. I think they're born pregnant. And spider mite damage, it's kind of what it looks like on the leaf. And takes a leaf that's just okay and makes it not okay. So, and the underside looks silvery, so you'd have to turn, you have to look underneath, because a lot of things like to hide on the bottom of the leaf. So examine your plant thoroughly when you're doing it. And if something starts making your flowers not look pretty, well, hey, that's the whole reason you wanted the plant in the first place, was for those flowers. So, and damage not seen until it's too late. I think that happens to a lot of things. So you don't want those black rot. If it looks like that, that's not good. Okay. Okay. So if you see any of these things, you definitely probably want to get rid of that plant. Actually, if you see any of those black rot things, I don't think there's any comeback from that. You sure don't want it around your other plants. And okay. Having a hard time reading what the title of the slide is. Anyway, different kinds. What you see in the stores mostly are, you see cymbidiums, some, not all year round usually, but you do see cymbidiums. And when they make their flower spikes, they're very, very pretty. I've seen these for sale at orchid shows. I'm not sure that I've ever seen them for sale in a grocery store. And these are the cymbidiums. And like I said, mine, they look kind of ratty on the leaves, but they put out a flower spike every year and they live outside at my house. And if it's really, really, really cold, sometimes I throw a blanket over them, but that's about it. Dendrodiums, there's a lot of different kinds of dendrodiums. I had a lot of them at different times, and you start getting the fancy different shapes, and they're really neat. Okay. Okay, you see, these are ones that you see a lot in the stores, on Oncidium, I can't think. And they look like little dancing ladies. You see these, the ones on the left side, you see those a lot. And it looks like a whole ballet of dancing ladies when you see them, because they're tiny and they're on long stems and look really, really pretty. I think I've seen a few slipper orchids in the grocery stores, but not too many. And if you don't have good light, apparently this one would be good, because it'll tolerate a little less light. Okay. And these vandas, they look sort of like a fowl and have some outrageous colors and look really pretty. hanging there with their roots just in the air. Okay. Resources, we have lots and lots and lots of resources that you can get a hold of. And this is the end of our usual slideshow where we have information about how to reach master gardeners. Now, I'm going to pause for a minute and see if there were any more questions that anybody wanted before I go into the one I made for showing how to repot. Were there any more questions, Robin? Feel like I've been talking really fast. I'm not hearing anything, so I'm going to stop share and I'm going to open up the other PowerPoint.
Linda, while you're doing that, one person did have questions about staking and has difficulties centering and staking their plants when they're repotting them.
Oh, okay. Well, hopefully you'd be repotting them when they didn't need staking. If you follow me. If you're talking about trying to stake a flower stem, I don't think I would want to try to repot a orchid while it had a flower stem that was developing, because that would be hard not to damage the flowers.
Yeah, it's not an ideal time for repotting.
No.
Although I do tend to put a stake in personally when I repot, just because it's the easiest time to get it through the root mass, which has been trimmed back. Just to put one stake in near the center of the plant if I can.
I think that, that makes a lot of sense to me too. And I've also had some plants that kind of are climbing out of the pot and sort of sideways. And you really have to, when you're repotting them, you need to work at getting them back upright and looking okay. Can you see my screen?
I can't.
Okay, then I've got to go get back to. Okay, I'm not.
Okay, and then people have questions about killing insects and what's the best way for killing bugs. But I mean, we could talk about the common orchid predators.
Yeah, well, we got bugs to talk about.
Is that coming up?
Yeah, it's coming up if I can figure out how to get to my other PowerPoint. And I don't know why I can't get to my other PowerPoint. Because I had it open. Pardon me, folks. I am not an expert on things. And okay. I think I must have closed it. How to repot an orchid. Okay, that's the one I want.
Okay, I'm going to answer some questions about bandas and other things in here because
okay,
I know those answers.
Good, because I don't.
I just have to find where it is in this chat here. Okay.
I'm going to go ahead and start the next one, and you're going to answer those questions in the chat, right?
I'll do as many as I can.
Okay. All right. I think I have maybe. Okay, I do. All right.
There we go.
Yes. I think I'm finally there. Yes. Okay. All right. So, how to repot an orchid. Okay, this is one of the orchids that was is like the orchids that I've put in the kits that I'm giving away. And this one needed to be repotted because it's been a couple of years, at least. It has babies. It was making babies. And so it needed to do it. So, and may have, can't see what it says down there, may have, I can't read my whole slide because I've got pictures in front. And I'm not sure how to get There, okay. May have pests. In fact, I guarantee the people who are going to get orchid kits, I have labeled these teaching orchids. And what makes them a teaching orchid is they come with bugs. And so it gives you an opportunity to learn how to kill bugs. And it also reinforces a protocol that you ought to put into place for all of your plants. When you buy a new plant, you bring it home, you should keep it isolated for a while until you find out if it's brought anything with it, because bugs can travel quite well hiding in little crevices, and you don't know it until they've grown big enough for you to see them. And if you've plunked your orchid down in among your other orchids that were already healthy, guess what? They now have bugs too. And so it's just like chicken pox in a classroom. If one kid gets them, everybody else is going to get them unless they got vaccinated. Anyway, so the orchid that you bring home, keep it separate for a while. Don't plunk it down with the others. Make sure that you have a good clean orchid before you start letting it socialize with your other plants. Okay, now why? Okay, so things that you need to repot. Tools you need. You need an orchid that needs to be repotted. You need a ceramic catch pot. That's what the one on the outside that keeps your furniture from getting wet. You need a plastic orchid pot liner, which most of them come with. And then in your kit, you find some cotton swabs that can be used, alcohol wipes, bamboo skewers, scissors and small clippers, small artist paintbrushes, sometimes handy, tweezers, rubbing alcohol, potting media. Those things are all come in handy when you're working on potting your orchid. So before you do it, you soak it. And all the ones that are in the kits were soaked last Thursday. And so they're on their way towards being dry. So if you're getting a kit today, you probably want to wet it again before taking it apart. And so when you take it, and most of these orchids that come from the grocery store, almost all, some of them are in bark, but the majority of them are packed in sphagnum moss. And that's what this one looked like when I took it out of the plant. And as you can see, some of the roots were growing through the holes. And so those broke off when I pulled it out of the pot. But there's not much you can do about that. Anyway, so you have now this mass of potting media and orchid, and it's time to start working. And it took quite a while to tease all of that sphagnum moss out of that bundle. So when I was done, that top picture shows you how much sphagnum moss there was. And the bottom picture shows you what the orchid looked like after everything had been trimmed and it was free of the old potting media. And when I put these packages together for these kits, I wrapped each orchid in a piece of newspaper that you can use to work on, so that when you get done and you've gotten all the old mix off, you can wrap that up and you can put it in your grain waste or your compost. And then the new potting mix is wrapped in newspaper as well. And so you can open it up and have a surface to work on that saves your tablecloth or your counter. So after you've done that, now is the time to inspect for bugs. And these bugs, I have spent hours chasing these little mealy bugs because they love to hide, and they go through several stages of growth called instars when they are becoming adults. And when they start off, they are so tiny, it is really, really hard to see them. And they like to hide under leaves and at the crevices where the leaves come off of the stem, and they are a pain in the patoot. And that's what they look like when they're running around, and they hurt the orchid because they have a mouth that pierces, and they pierce the orchid and they suck its juices out. And so use any means necessary to wage war on mealybugs. Alcohol works really good. And that's why if you have a bottle, I keep a bottle of alcohol that is just for fighting mealybugs. It doesn't get used for anything else. It's just used for fighting mealybugs. And I have used the cotton swabs. Those are good for getting into crevices. An artist paintbrush is really good because you kind of get in there and really poke at the mealybugs and get after them. And the alcohol wipes are when you've done doing all this, you can also use them to clean the leaves, top and bottom. And you can use them to clean the catch pot before you repot. And you can use it to clean your tools. So all of those things are good to do. There's the catch pot that the orchid came out of, and it gets cleaned, and then you start repotting. And for the mama orchid, for this one, remember this one had babies, I used the potting mix on the left-hand side, and it has fir bark, and it has sphagnum moss nuggets, and it has perlite, and it has charcoal. So it's a clean, fast draining, but will retain some moisture mix and it will probably take quite a while to break down and before you need to repot again. And then I did the babies in the sphagnum moss. So you put a little bit of the potting mix in the bottom of the plastic pot, and then you put your orchid in there, get it in the position you'd like it to be in, and then carefully start adding the potting mixture back in around and tuck it around. You don't really want big holes. You want to pack it in there pretty good. And then after you're all done, you want to water it. And with the babies, I cut the piece of stem that they were on, but they came with roots. They had fully developed roots. So the piece of stem, I filled the little plastic pot with the sphagnum moss, and then I just stuck the kikis, which means little one in Hawaiian, into the pot. And you want to find a bright light place for them to go. And in my house, on my kitchen sink window is where the two babies are going to live anyway. So that is basically how you repot an orchid. So any questions?
Linda, there's a question about using alcohol as a preventative. Apparently I'm thinking before you see any bugs.
Oh, well, those little the alcohol wipes, they're like what doctors use before they give you a shot and stuff. And I don't think that would hurt anything. I can't think of any. Can you think of any reason why it would hurt?
I wouldn't use anything prophylactically.
I've never done that either. I guess I'm conservative that way. Why put something on your plant that doesn't need to be there?
Yeah, I guess it hasn't come up for me because I've had mealybugs forever. And so it seems like I never have an opportunity to not have mealybugs. So
well, when you water your orchids every week, it's a good time, or every 7 to 10 days.
Right.
It's a good time to do a physical examination of each orchid.
Right. You're looking at it, and that's a good time. I mean, because if there's going to be something at that kind of frequency, you would have you'd have plenty of opportunity to get in there and try to kill it while it's small, rather than let it get out of hand. I think we're good. So thank you everybody for coming.